Before we go into the panel discussion and the themes, I need to comment on something that has been recurring since last night that I think is vitally important. And that is this integration of educational systems, whether it's elementary, secondary, post-secondary, or whether it's integration across sectors between the corporate community and the educational system. And I think that there are some remarkable examples of those kind of integrated systems in West Virginia. And first of all, the best part of being in a foundation, no, it's not giving away money, because you annoy more people than you please, by the way, just because you don't have that much money. So that's not the good part. Here's the good part. I get to travel around and meet really interesting people and sometimes introduce them to one another. So it's sort of a matchmaking service of sorts. But what I have been able to discover is there are these remarkable pockets of innovation in West Virginia. And the challenge is, and this is a challenge to the legislators, but also the administrators in public education, how do we take these pockets and scale up? How do we make an institutional sort of scope from these pockets of innovation or experimentation without killing the creativity that goes into those pockets of innovation? And I'd like to mention just a couple, if I may, before we move into the discussion, because I think they're worth noting. We were talking about in the last panel the importance of getting the business sector more firmly integrated into the educational sector. And that's a given. Everybody does it. But I've seen some remarkable examples through the Education Alliance in partnership with West Virginia Manufacturing Association, in which whole school classes go into manufacturing sites for a year, and they are given a challenge from the company, either in product development, processing, distribution, and these teams of students with their teachers have to solve the problem and then pitch it to the Shark Tank of company executives. Every aspect of prototyping, processing, production, and distribution is integrated into the coursework. It doesn't get more relevant than that. And there have been some remarkable products that have come out of these student teams. And it's an illustration of how you can meld these two sectors. So it's not so much companies being more engaged in telling schools what kind of curricula to develop. It's really engaging students in the process of that company's business. Another one has to do with Carnegie Mellon University, which you've heard about earlier from the mayor. It is really an international center for robotics and artificial intelligence. It doesn't have a college of education. So one of the roboticists was looking for challenges from the education center, and he very refreshingly said, we don't want to just invent things and figure out how to sell them. We want to invent things because there's a human challenge, an educational challenge put forth. So they partnered with the Harless Center to figure out how to develop educational technologies that the Harless Center can train teachers in implementing. And they have instituted programs that teach poetry through the creation of robots. You know, it's not STEM for its own sake. It's STEM that leads to a social purpose. And now that partnership, from southern West Virginia to central Pittsburgh, where roboticists are teaming with professional educators, makes for that complementary notion that that particular program is now internationally recognized and has brought millions of NSF dollars into West Virginia. And the third example I want to bring up is Senator Plymel, through his affiliation with Southern Regional Education Board, has brought highly rigorous college preparation coursework into West Virginia's career and tech ed system. Career and Tech Ed in West Virginia, through this SREB program, is no longer a terminal program. It is a college prep program. It elevates technical education to the rest of the academic preparation programs of the secondary system. And those programs, the SREB program, which gives kids college credits while they're in high school, has matched up with the simulated workplace program that you've seen so much about, and it's been absolutely remarkable. For those of you who were able to visit the student demo yesterday, Ben Franklin Technical School here has a business partnership where they are taking college preparatory classes in engineering. They designed and built solar paneled electric generation units that they're selling and donating. So there's an international market, and they've done it through a business partnership. To me, it's the most remarkable example of rigorous technical education teamed with a local company to create a business. And these students, and I have to underline this because a lot of technical students were seen as the not college track. These kids are all going to college. They're all going to either WVU, one's going to MIT. It's a technical school that's a college prep school. That's what it's become. These are wonderful models. These are illustrations that you have. Scaling, that's the challenge ahead of us. So that's enough of my speech. I apologize for that. But I do want to underscore the fact that innovation in learning often comes, actually as any invention, comes in the real world outside of the academy, and that's the cross-pollination of different sectors. The more you can mix different business, education, artistic, technical fields together, that's where you get new ideas. That's what Da Vinci did. I just wanted to mention that. Because most innovations started in Italy. We all know that. It doesn't need to be underscored. So, and then it spread out. So let's talk about our panel, because we do have three people who represent national organizations that have really been on the cutting edge of reform in education that's really emphasized creativity, student-directed learning, group learning, a lot of the attributes that we heard last night, the attributes that employers are looking for that are beyond the content of certain disciplines and certain majors. And I think what's really going to be important, and one of the things I want to underscore, is as innovation is taking place in the classroom and students are learning in a whole new way by working in groups, working much like they do in the corporate sector, our teacher preparation programs, training teachers in how to deal with it and promote it. That's going to be a challenge, I think, for higher ed as we move forward. So what I'd like to do, introduce the panel quickly. They're each going to give a comment or two about the work that they're doing in education. And then we are going to, I'm going to ask them to really talk among themselves and argue and disagree and challenge one another in a good dialectic that we all encourage, and then open it up for comments and questions from the audience. But first we have Rebecca Wolfe, who's Associate Vice President with Jobs for the Future out of Boston, and she oversees Students at the Center, which is really about student-centered learning with a special emphasis on low-income and minority students. We have Susan Patrick, who's President and CEO of the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, and she's been an active advocate nationally for personalized learning and looking at graduate profiles that articulate those kind of attributes and skills that go beyond educational requirements. And we have Ann Sekula, who is the director of the Remake Learning Council, which is an association of educators, researchers, artists, tech firms, and politicians in Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And that's been another forum where I think a lot of innovation has come from the cross-fertilization of some of these great ideas embedded here in West Virginia, some of those that are being generated in Pittsburgh. And it's creating new models of education. So they're each going to talk about what innovation means, and in particular, looking at where some of the policy challenges and the policy opportunities are. So first, I'd like to start with Rebecca, if I may.
So I may actually ask you to switch spots with me.
Okay.
Because we're going to shake it up ever so slightly. And rather than starting and just sort of telling you everything about us and arguing perhaps with each other, we want to do a little bit of frame setting first about what is this stuff when we say learner-centered education and student-centered and really sort of getting to, I mean, you heard earlier today, our fabulous MC talked about deeper learning. What does that actually mean and why should we care? So I can tell you that one thing about learner-centered education is it isn't asking students to sit with their butts in the seats staring at some people at the front of the room for hours and hours on end. So rather than talking at you, we are going to ask that you turn to each other for just 1 minute each, which I know is hard, you're legislators, 1 minute each, and I want you to share with somebody next to you a meaningful learning experience that you have had in your life. And notice I very purposely did not say a meaningful experience at school. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. So think about a meaningful learning experience, and you each have 1 minute to try to just explain what was meaningful about that, what was that experience. Please. I'm going to briefly share a quick mind-meaningful learning experience because it's a great metaphor for, if we can maybe get the slides back up in a moment, and if not, I can point you to a point in the book. So a great metaphor for what at Jobs for the Future we came up with as our definition of what it means to be student-centered learning, and we didn't just pull that out of the ethos, we pulled it out of looking at hundreds of research reports on learning theory, on evidence of good learning and teaching. We actually know what it means to learn and to teach well, we just don't often do it. And so we've encapsulated that in a framework of student-centered learning, which is very similar to what each of you was just describing with your words. So, no? All right, why don't we just bring the regular slides back up? Okay, can we bring the regular slides back up? So, at Jobs for the Future, so just quickly, nationally, we work around the country to ensure that all low-income people are able to realize the promise of economic mobility. So we work across intentionally bridging the education and the workforce sectors with a specific focus on low-income and traditionally marginalized populations. So students at the center, as Jim said, we're trying to look at the learning aspect of that and connect it to the career aspect. So I learned to drive stick shift in the foothills just outside of Hillsborough in Pocahontas County. It was the one and only time before now I have actually been in West Virginia. I was visiting my college roommate, and we had spent about a year with my father trying to teach me to drive manual. That didn't go real well. He mostly just yelled at me. But here I was in gorgeous West Virginia in some really terrifying hills, and the moment was right. And it was extraordinarily personalized, which for us is part one of being student-centered. I desperately wanted to learn manual. I knew it would help me in life. I knew it was helpful. And I was at a moment where I needed a relationship with a different kind of teacher. My dad wasn't working, but my best buddy, who was my college roommate, who I deeply trusted, who I knew wasn't going to yell at me, that was the personal touch I needed. It was student-owned. I owned that learning. I wanted to learn that. I was motivated to do that, so nothing was going to stand in my way. And I had a peer teaching me. It was anytime, anywhere. It was not in a classroom. It was on a road. It was on a hill. There was traffic coming at us. There was behind us. It was real time in a real situation that had some real consequences. which is that final piece, competency-based, which I'm hoping Susan will talk some more about as well. There was clear understanding of whether or not I learned. It was authentic. It was transparent. I knew if I could get up that hill and not slide back, I knew if I could not bust her transmission, that I had succeeded. So this is where the metaphor ends, because if all I had stopped with at student-centered learning was learning to drive a car, which I did, and I kick ass now at driving stick shift, and I'm still proud of that, that would not have gotten me very far in life. So that's why the other critical part of our framework and our research shows that to really get somewhere, you need to incorporate those competencies and skills you've been hearing a lot about. You really need to be thinking about the purpose. And for us, that purpose is at the end, the knowledge, the skills, and the dispositions that we know you need to actually succeed. It is no longer an either or. It is not, do I learn reading, writing, math, and comp science, or do I learn how to collaborate? We have to be doing these as joined skills. We have to be teaching these as joined competencies. So for us, to truly be embracing good learning, you have to have all four of those principles, and you have to be doing it in a way that gets us at those college, career, and civic life. So I'm gonna actually pause there because I wanted to help kind of set a big frame, get y'all a little bit more engaged, and I want to turn it to my colleagues who are going to talk about some specific examples where we see this happening, and then we'll circle back and we'll talk a little bit more about the policy and some other connections.
Susan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Susan Patrick, I'm president of iNACOL, which originally started in 2002, focused on online learning and specifically expanding access to courses for students statewide. One of the early examples is actually when I was at the U.S. Department of Education working for the Secretary on the Rural Education Task Force. We highlighted West Virginia's virtual school program. As you may know, across the U.S., 50% of our high schools don't offer calculus. 25% of our high schools across the U.S. don't offer advanced courses defined as math courses over Algebra 2, a number of chemistry, physics. And so in 2002, online learning was a pretty interesting innovation. Our work has changed dramatically and evolved over the last 15 years. We are now working with 75% of the school districts offer online learning today to make those options available. But now we're working on within schools across the country. How are you modernizing learning environments so students are truly getting a world-class education? How can you identify gaps in every student's learning genome so that they are prepared for college and future careers? What does it look like when you can create interdisciplinary Da Vinci-like pathways for students to learn? And we work with more than 50 countries around the globe, and I work with educators in all 50 states. And we also work on best practice and policy. So last year I worked in 38 states with legislators and policymakers to take a look at what's in the education code over the last 50 years that are barriers to innovation. And we've worked with states like Kentucky, Virginia. Rebecca's also working with many of these states. We work with JFF and KnowledgeWorks on how do you create innovation zones for learning where you have really amazing educators trying to change the future of learning for students in your state to be prepared. So I'll just end by saying back in 2007, 2008, there were like a handful, 5, 10, really interesting new learning models across the US. And we're working on a national research study right now. And we've identified more than 12,000 breakthrough school models across the US. So there is pent-up demand in communities for more engaging. This is not about the technology. This is about designing learning environments that dramatically challenge students to dig in, have projects in the community, in internships, in the workforce, where they are earning their competencies and credits on knowledge and skills, and they can take that with them for future success. So thank you.
Hi, think I'm on here, and Sekula with the Remake Learning Network. So Remake Learning is a 10-year-old network. We celebrated our anniversary this summer. That has been coming together to really, for 10 years to really think about these kinds of transformational learning that we need for the new age. We look at our educational system and it has not changed since really 100 years when 10 industrialists got together and formed the public education system that was going to fill our factories. And that's just not the reality of the economy, but the education system really hasn't transformed. So in Pittsburgh, we really looked at the technology innovation that's happening in our city. We looked at sort of the opportunities that were there with technology and media for children. We looked at the assets that we had in our region of having a wonderfully creative community, a wonderful tech community, and also a very rich, particularly in the urban setting to start with, a very rich culturally connected community for children and families. So we have a lot of out-of-school time programming, a lot of museums and wonderful library systems. And so, it was a very simple idea of what could we do if we put these assets together to really think about how we would transform learning in our region. And so after kind of a 10-year period of experimentation and working on this, what we see and what really resonates are a lot of the themes that Susan and Rebecca have shared, what we've seen around the country, and have been very connected nationally of trying to learn from others and bring it into Pittsburgh and into our region, but also what we were really learning of these cross-sectoral partnerships that we put together in our network to really focus on the kinds of learning, the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that kids need to have in the modern age, and the kind of learning experiences that can provide those opportunities for kids. And so, we worked to, I think initially, so much of what you talk about are these cross-sectoral partnerships. That is a foundational piece of what we coordinated in the region. We supported at a very grassroots level the catalyzation around that. So how then, if there's a great idea that's emerging, can we give just a bit small scale support to allow that idea to come out of an after school program or a library program or a university setting that's working with a preschool to catalyze those type of experiences and ideas and innovators to think about that. And those innovators are not just the technologists, those innovators are kindergarten teachers. And then to capture that information, and so much of what I've heard here as well, and really communicate that message. What does this look like? What are these learning experiences? How do we take them from being isolated in one classroom in one setting so that all of us can see broadly and experience what we're trying to move forward to? So a ton of communications and showcasing were really critical to what we've done. And then I think, moving as this elevated over that 10-year period of time to really coordinate specifically around what has emerged as those themes and great opportunities that we want to move forward, to think about what are our assets that we have there so we're not duplicating efforts, how are we communicating those efforts more broadly to the people outside of our network, and then what are those challenges that we still have? A lot of that is research, a lot of that is policy, and so we put together these working groups to really focus on pre-service teacher training and other things that are helping connect and move that scale forward in a bigger way than sort of those isolated innovative efforts. So that's sort of the story of Remake and the history of what we've done and how we have supported and want to help others to form that similar type of network in their own communities.
Great. Rebecca, back to you, talking about some of the policy.
Just realized we got our word cloud up.
There it is, Da Vinci. Should be bigger. No, but just to talk about some of the policy implications, then I'd like to go back with a few questions that I think we would want the legislators to ponder over lunch. Go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Not on anymore. It was doing better when I was just shouting. So one of the things that we've done at Jobs for the Future is take that sort of very high level framework that's based on research, and I would be remiss if I didn't wave around the book that we just came out with this past spring from Harvard Ed Press that really compiles some of the best thinking in reading and research on how do we actually prepare students for what comes next. It's Rethinking Readiness. So how do we pair rethinking readiness with career readiness? So at Jobs for the Future, we support a number of different efforts that basically come under the rubric of deeper learning career pathways. So one such pathway is through apprenticeship. We actually were here in the state talking with some of amazing leaders, a few in Charleston and some of the community colleges back in April about the beginnings of apprenticeship programs. There are really clear data on how profound moving the average age of apprenticeship lower and thinking of it more as a pre-career opportunity for students both enables them to earn while they're still in school and also starts speaking to the employers, as we heard in the wonderful panel earlier, by saying, what do you need? It starts pulling in the employers. So there are some strong implications needed around thinking about who is certified to teach in apprenticeships. So there's implications for policies there, who actually has the kinds of certification needed both to be the classroom instructor or to be the certified technician that's able to work with the employer. We also do a lot with our Pathways to Prosperity initiative, in which we're in 13 different states, where we've been invited in by either the governor or the state commissioner or occasionally by a community college system to help at the policy level do what we call an asset map. So we look across the state with a very collaborative project working across all the sectors to say, similarly to what Susan was saying that they work on, what are the policies that are either enabling or getting in the way of primarily what we call 9 through 14 pathways, although more and more we're starting to call them 14 through 9, because we're finding that when the K-12 system leads these pathways, they stay in K-12. They never truly become something that's helping point a student at what comes next. They never truly become career connected. So we're actually starting to more and more call them 14 through 9 pathways. So we're working at a systems level to say, what are the policies that need to be in place there? Dual enrollment and dual credit is a powerful one. You heard some great stories earlier today. I was really excited to hear about, is it ShoalNet? That is working, that is influencing both, in the Pittsburgh region, but having great spillover effects. So incredibly profound data we've seen with early college, high school movements. So that takes funding, but it also really takes policy enabling conditions. One of the best examples we've seen is the work we've done in Texas around early college. They have just completely embraced it. And in Texas, as you may know, everything in education is legislated. So right down to what books they use, what the budget is, actually is set by the legislature. So Texas has gotten completely behind the early college, high school movement. And they recently estimated that students in an early college, high school over a lifetime will earn $250,000 more than peers who did not because of the jump they get towards an associate degree. Well, in Texas, they have 18,000 students enrolled in early college. That is $4.6 billion in additional earnings for students over their lifetime. And again, huge implications on tax revenue, investment back in the state. So those are just a few of the places where, as we're starting to bridge from K-12 into more of our career pathways and workforce development, there's a lot of work the legislature can do to open up those innovation zones.
Did you comment on those policy implications of that kind of educational integration?
Are you pointing to me?
Anybody, either Susan.
I mean, absolutely. Rebecca, just to build on it, we're in a rare opportunity in time right now in K through 12 education in America, and I'm not sure everybody fully understands this. When No Child Left Behind was reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act on December 10th, 2015. And all of our organizations, Chip, Rebecca, all of us worked tirelessly. The staff on Capitol Hill worked in an incredibly bipartisan way. I mean, those hearings, everyone was getting along, and there was no negativity, and everybody was rolling up their sleeves. You know why? Because they heard from states, like, give us room, give us flexibility. Our schools are ready to start innovating, and that is true. And what's happened is, like, we have this opportunity now. The flexibility is back to communities and back to states, and I'm not sure communities know that because they've been frozen out of the process for saying, what are the purposes and goals of our education system for the future? It's unfrozen now. So this year, 2017, all states had to turn in their new state plans, the US Department of Ed. Most of them look so much like No Child Left Behind plus one additional measure. Come on. And Congress is saying, didn't you ask for this? What are we doing? Like right now, we have a chance to say, okay, education in America is controlled at the state level, okay? And it's local control too. Like the localities have, 13,600 localities have the ability to say, guess what? The federal government is not telling us the values of our education system. So what is the purpose and meaning of education right now for our kids to be prepared for the future? And it looks a heck of a lot different. This is happening around the world, right? Changes are happening around the world and how students are learning what they're learning and what pathways they have. So the good news is, in ESSA, it says every state has the ability to amend their plan at every time because we want to move this from compliance to continuous improvement. So we're just getting started. It is time to have deep conversations around, is our system of K through 12 education fit for purpose? Can you articulate the purpose and the goals and the values? What does that look like? And we can come back on the federal opportunities, but highly qualified teacher provisions are gone. So we can be creative in preparing our educators and our teacher workforce. We can rethink our College of Ed programs. We can start looking at things like micro-credentials and not siloing career and tech and college readiness.
Yeah, and I think that, so we've been as a region 10 years into this, and about 2 years we started seriously convening those, breakthrough innovators to talk about policy, because we were hearing what, how does this scale across the state? How do we begin, what do you need? And a lot of those leading superintendents and others just said, I mean, the standardized tests that we're taking now aren't measuring what we really need to be doing for kids. And so that's a barrier that still exists, but they sort of said, so we just put that aside and we innovated anyways. And so, what can we do, I think, basically is to give them flexibility, mandate waivers in these innovation zones, allowing that experimentation so that they can work with researchers out of your schools of education to think about how do we assess good project-based learning? How do we think about the outcomes around maker spaces? What's, other than AP computer science, what are the other computational thinking competencies, micro-credentialing, and other things that we can build along the way from K-12, which we have K-12 computational thinking programs happening in Pittsburgh regional schools, that we allow this to happen and have equal weight. So it's allowing some flexibility at district levels, is what we've heard from these leading groups. I think it's that ability to explore, because this is a time of exploration. Nobody's got the answer. I think there's a lot of coalescence around what is the future of learning need to look like at this day and age. So you're not having to invent it from scratch here in West Virginia, but still allowing your educators and your communities that ability to take all of these great ideas and make it their own. And so what does that look like for West Virginia? And then I think, working with your schools of education in a number of ways around studying and rapid prototyping new kinds of research around outcomes, so that we know these experiments that were happening if they're meaningful or not, and then what is the thing that we're going to scale in your state. And then I think the schools of education, which you've already started, as Jim mentioned, through some of the partnerships with the Create Lab Satellite Network and others, of really rethinking pre-service teacher training. So in the past, we've been focused on pre-service teacher training to come out and teach to the test. They've got to be ready to come right out into the environment that they're coming into. Those teachers, our leading superintendents are telling us, are not prepared to teach in these modern classrooms at all. It's the teachers that came in before No Child Left Behind who did project-based learning and who really understood and are now so excited that the shackles are being taken off that they can go back to the way that they originally were teaching. So there's a lot of room of innovation that needs to be opened up in our pre-service teacher training programs and professional development programs that are all aspects that you have control over as legislators.
Can I go back for a moment, though, before we move on, because I want to talk about assessment and teacher prep some more, but I think we have to underline what Susan said about ESSA, that it can be modified. I think we are so indoctrinated into static plans, much like you said, a lot of the ESSA plans look like No Child Left Behind plans. Tradition and inertia are powerful forces. So we need to, I think, just red line that statement that the State Board of Ed has the opportunity to make adjustments as we go. It's not bound. And I think sometimes our culture, if we don't call it out and say we need to reassess some of these things, it doesn't always happen. So I just wanted to reinforce that. But go ahead, Rebecca, you were going to say something.
I was just going to basically pile on, and this is why, I laughed when you said we should argue with each other, because mostly I just want to stand up and say amen when these women speak, because just great points. One thing I want to add, and I don't have a silver bullet for you, but I have at dinner last night and in the hallways today, just a couple of quick conversations with folks brought up a sense that in West Virginia that the teachers' unions are presenting a real obstacle to the kinds of innovation and ongoing learning and the kinds of new anything that we want to be tried. And I would just encourage you to get over it, because there are every state I go to tells me about what an issue their teacher union is and how they can't do anything because of the teacher union. And part of what you're hearing from Anne is find those sparks of light. Find the teachers who really get it and who want to work with you. Find the union president in a small town who deeply understands how much that town needs to change and work with him or her. So, and part of what this ESSA moment, as both Jim was just saying and Susan was saying, is we're not done. This has got to be a continuous improvement process. So what a great opportunity to bring those union leaders into the conversation now, and bring them to Pittsburgh, bring them to Remake Learning Days, because there is nothing more powerful than seeing the excitement of children fired up by learning. These people are teachers because they care about learning. And although that may not be what comes out when you have contract negotiations, if you get them back where they live, which is I am in this profession because I care about children and learning, if you can take them to those schools where learning looks nothing like what they experience, then you have the start of a conversation. So again, we have all been in states where unions are powerful, but that should not be what is stopping you from starting to really point West Virginia in the direction that it needs to go.
That's a very good point.
Well, and I think that's the other part about the communication. Like, what are you shining the spotlight on? I have 6 sisters, 4 of them are teachers, and they talk about the teacher down the hall, right, who's doing something innovative, or if they are the teacher doing innovative, sort of the slack the challenges that they get from their peers. I think if you are highlighting those best practices within your school building, within your community, there's a competition that happens there that is very real. And so that's why we think about the communications assets that we do as a network are really to elevate those great ideas. And truly, they start in an after-school program that a teacher is let them go loose on the coding program after school. Eventually, and you continue to give that person the support, it gets filtered in through the whole school district. And there's leadership that's required to do that at a school level, but this is truly the slow scale of innovative grassroots change, so that you can't, then it's not a mandate down on top of these that they can fight back against. It's slowly bubbling up, and more want to participate. And then I think the other is making sure you have what we have seen bubble up, incredible professional learning opportunities for educators. So we have over 60 documented professional development providers in the region, and many of those are in West Virginia as well, that are letting teachers explore with these kinds of new resources and learning opportunities in a way that is really truly what we've called one of the intermediate units programs, the Center for Creativity, a playground for teachers to come in and just explore with the new technologies, to learn from their peers, because there's no experts in this. And then what we have seen are all of these different peer learning networks that have popped up, where the teachers are working with each other around how am I becoming a facilitator in my classroom rather than a lecturer, and exploring and finding those kind of connectivities. So we've spent a lot of time documenting, communicating those opportunities for educators, finding ways that they have release time, so getting them out of the classroom. And so that's another set of resources that you can provide or make sure are there as buffers, is a way that teachers can go and see a teacher 2 counties over that's doing something super cool, and providing those networked opportunities so that our professional development systems are not so boring and antiquated as our classrooms are.
And by the way, if I can just add, West Virginia's scale and the networks among educators are a real asset to creating these peer learning models. The Education Alliance has a network of 8 exemplary STEM schools that are professional development centers for one another. Cabell County has a nationally recognized expeditionary learning school, as does Kanawha County. Mm-hmm. These are just examples of sites that should be laboratories for their peers. And I think we have all the mechanisms here for that.
Could I just pick up on that
Well,
point?
you may.
Thank you. I think that's really important to remember, that the scale here is something you can get your hands around. And just one great example I just heard about, I was in Colorado 2 days ago, and district superintendent was on a panel talking about work-based learning partnerships. He has fewer than 500 students in his district, so tiny, rural, very poor, very isolated. He went to a very inspiring conference in Seattle and basically grabbed the work-based learning coordinator there. In a year, that work-based coordinator, who he scraped together a little bit of funding for him, got 45 different businesses to donate equipment to an empty building that was unused because, again, poor, small, rural, empty storefronts. He has $800,000 worth of machinery and equipment now in that building, all for free, and all connected to job pathways for his students. He is now pulling students from neighboring districts that are larger and have more partnerships to come on a shared basis to work in his facilities. And he didn't do that because he went to companies and said, could I please have a handout? He went and said, what do you need? And what they needed was students who knew how to work this machinery. So small can be a real benefit. He was able to be nimble in a way that he was sitting next to somebody from Denver and said, I could never do that, because the paperwork alone that it would have taken to make those partnerships, to get that equipment, to set it up, doesn't happen. But because he was small and nimble, because he could go to the one cafe in town and see all of his school board, all of his committee, and his legislature in the one cafe, he could make things happen at a speed and at a sort of really contextual way that makes sense, that you can't do in many of those bigger settings.
Absolutely. I'd like to go back to assessment for a moment, because we talked about the groan that people utter when you talk about standardized tests. And in contrast to that, we've heard about the attributes that employers want: communications, writing skills, leadership, group problem solving, deductive reasoning, all traditionally humanities and liberal arts. So how do we create a performance-based assessment for students that can reflect those attributes? Because you don't take a bubble test to say how you're doing on leadership. So, and who's doing it well? Let's start there. Comments?
Anybody got you might have a better answer.
Well, I'd just say it's interesting. As I mentioned, I work with 50 countries around the world and spent time on a fellowship with the OECD in Paris and the education experts from the European Commission in Brussels. And all of my different meetings had a really interesting tenor to them, which was these global education experts who study accountability and the importance of transparency and accountability around the world said, Susan, what the heck is the US doing right now? We all moved away from this 20 or 30 years ago. And it was really interesting to talk to the experts from Finland who said, 40 years ago, we were where the US is. Now they're the highest performing education system. So you have to take a long view, which is sometimes hard in education policy in the US, as to where we want to get to. And I'm getting right to performance assessment, I promise, Jim.
Okay.
But this context is really important because they said, you have a system right now that requires you to do annual standardized testing because you have to have a norm reference test because you don't trust your educators to validate and measure proficiency consistently and reliably. So in these other countries, what do they do in their teacher ed programs? They go deep on assessment literacy, which is what is the appropriate assessment, including performance assessment, for the type of learning you're doing, and they have moderation practices. We think about calibration across educators where they know with a 97% consistency that they are judging mastery correctly system-wide. When you have that in your teacher professional judgment and capacity in colleges of ed and throughout their career, then you don't need standardized testing because you have a more reliable instrument for the learning taking place between the learner and the teacher, and the learner and the expectation. Think about that. If we have a system right now where our teachers don't have the capacity to judge mastery, to judge whether a student has learned, what are we doing? Honestly, we've got to start building in that capacity for performance assessment that will allow students to build on this range of content knowledge, applying it in novel ways, and building all of these skills. And we can do that, and there are programs doing that. But the schools and the districts that we're working with, they're doing all of their professional development themselves. There are schools in California creating graduate schools of education in their high schools to train the teachers because the teacher training programs are not producing the learning designers, the engineers, the performance assessment expertise that you need. And you know what's exciting about that? We can do that.
Yes.
It's doable.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the other things that we see, I think all of that is really important, and nobody wants to, I mean, we know how hard Common Core was, and so it's like, oh God, do we have to go through this again? But we have to as a country, we have to as states. You have the opportunity to be innovative as states and think about assessment systems very differently now, for what is right for your community. And so I think that's an important part of alignment. Other things that we're experimenting with as a region, but it's really hard to do it at a regional level on our own without, that buy-in of states or looking at student portfolios. I mean, all of this is all old, right? This has been around forever. There's not a lot that's super new. There's new data systems that can help capture this information in powerful ways. But, micro-credentialing, digital badging, portfolio assessments, rubric systems. My kids go to the lab school at the University of Pittsburgh, and they don't get grades, and it terrifies me sometimes, but it's all a rubric of where they're progressing towards mastery. It's all things that we have a lot of experience, and we just need to, to get online for what's right for kids and the future.
So at a meta level, is that not, that
You
may
can
not,
say.
I'll say meta level. So in the backs of your program books is a embargoed excerpt from a statement that we are putting out in about 2 or 3 weeks on 10 principles of high-quality systems of assessment for learning. So if at a state level or a district level, we were to truly create a system of assessment, some of which might include GASP, standardized testing, but includes the full balance level to actually get there, what it actually needs to entail. The statement is something that we have built off. We claim no original ownership on the language. It is built off of some of the best thinkers and experts, international and national, in assessment in the country. And it will be a consensus document. We right now have almost 12 national organizations who are signing on to it, all whom have a powerful stake in working in states, in policy, and in assessment. And the Alliance is one of our partners on it, and it will be featured on their Deeper Learning website with tools and resources. So what does it actually look like if we are building a full and complete system? So you don't have to reinvent the North Star. We've spent a long, painful year developing it for you, and it's really meant to be a place to start to assess where are you as a state in your systems of assessment, where do you still need to go to try to reach that North Star, and what's it going to take both in the education side, the legislature, and all the many other partners. So that's, again, you have a pre-copy. There will be a very pretty digitized version available in about a month on the Deeper Learning for All website for the Alliance. And then just a couple more points of light out there. We often talk about New Hampshire as a state that has really gone pretty far in thinking about performance assessment.
Okay.
And so any one of us up here can talk at length about them, but I know we're getting near time. And then the other state that I would really keep your eye on is your neighbor in Virginia. Some really powerful legislation there trying to reduce the number of standardized tests without lowering the rigor, and there is a very deep and prolonged 5-year process right now of building that capacity in their teachers. So all of what Susan was speaking so eloquently about, making sure that the teachers are highly trained and able to be the judges they should be of learning. So it's a major effort that we're a part of, and a lot of other partners.
Thank you.
Just really quick, I mean, I'd like to talk about it as systems, plural, of assessments, and there is a place for the checkpoint right now because we're not there yet, but in New Hampshire, they're just doing a standardized test in grades 3, 8, and then once in 11th grade as a checkpoint with the performance assessments for competency education. So there are different ways to get to this systems, plural, of assessments for learning and of learning.
That's an excellent point, that integrate the methods. And we're running late, so I'd like to take some questions, and frankly, given the time, I'd like the questions from legislators first, since this is your summit, and then from others.
I'd be interested to know from the legislators what's concerning for you about some of the things that we just shared. I know, everyone's looking like a little bit concerned. Yes.
I have to say that the thing that concerns me the greatest was the comment that you had to go to people who had previous experience before No Child Left
Yeah.
Behind to figure out what you're really supposed to do. What that tells me is, I mean, and please understand, I come from a public school education with a bunch of old ladies in grade school that were like the Gestapo.
Yeah, yeah.
And basically what they taught us were the basics, which we employed along the way and have done since. If you don't do those basics, all these things they tend to drive me crazy. I am very encouraged by the fact that you like, relating things to what is around you and why the education is important. I think is a good way to go, and it gets things back to a localized level, and I think that's good. But I tell you, that just scares. What have we been doing for the last 20 years is my question.
Yeah,
Time to
well,
look
no,
ahead.
I think it.
Don't look back, it'll
Yeah.
just scare you more.
I think
Look
that's what we
ahead.
hear from, so one of the things we are doing with pre-service teacher training programs in the region, West Liberty's participating, hopefully we can get somebody from WVU to join in this conversation too, is how are you innovating?
That's you.
How are you all, what are you going to do that is really trying to prepare teachers? Because they still have some shackles from in Pennsylvania at least, regulations of what they've got to do and how their students have to come out and produce. But so how are they then trying to do some things differently to give these kinds of experiences so that those teachers are starting, the young teachers are starting to think differently about their roles, which is exciting. I mean, when we think about the teacher pipeline as well, of who wants to become teachers, they don't want to come out and teach in this style. And so that's why we're having teacher shortage problems.
Other questions? Let me just add one comment. Oh, there is one? Dave Moore? No?
I have an observation. I'm an employer. I wasn't one of your panelists. And my number one, 99% score of an interview has to do with core values, integrity, honesty, ethics, et cetera. And I don't hear that in our conversation.
Right.
Employers need to convey that message to educators so that they understand that that's a no-go deal. If you can't get past that part of the interview, the rest of the interview is over. I don't care what your GPA is.
Right.
If educators heard that message from employers, that's why I'm speaking up, they can integrate that into their processes, procedure. Their teachers can send those messages. Parents are more and more advocating their responsibility to teach that. But the fact that that's not part of the conversation, I would call a concern.
Once again, if I could just comment, there are examples of using the formal education system to convey that sense of citizenship, ethics, social responsibility. There's actually a whole movement called digital humanities, which is don't learn STEM for STEM's sake, learn STEM in order to apply it to a social good. Those pockets of conversation, though, have to be elevated. That's one concern I have.
Yeah.
I would just say the example of like what Virginia's done with Profile of a Graduate are community-based conversations around this idea of what is the purpose of education, and they start with conversations around values, but that again has to happen at a local level of we want our graduates to have integrity, to have good judgment, to be strong in character, and that becomes a focus across that system in addition to the knowledge and skills, because that's what employers are looking for. That's what our democracy is looking for too.
Yeah, and I think the Profile of a Graduate is a great thing to do, and I think that really powerful results when school districts do that. The other thing I would just say to that is that when we talk about knowledge, skills, and dispositions, we were at a recent What's the Impact of Artificial Intelligence on the Future of Work conference that KnowledgeWorks has done an incredible set of work around, and I think I would advocate that you all we have some experience of this here in conversations. But when we think about in the future of work, what is the knowledge, skills, and dispositions we need to have? We had a room like this talking about it. There's very little that we knew to say what's the knowledge we need. We had a little bit more around skills. We talked about data fluency, writing, but everything else was dispositional. And so that's the kind of conversation that communities should be having with their educators, with their families, with their employers to really focus and get to what you're interested in.
Thank you. Round of applause for our panel.